I'm curious I know when I started turning to the Stoics, when I turned to Marcus Aurelius or I turned to Seneca, that really helped me kind of, maybe I just started scratching the surface and started reprogramming the algorithm in my mind. I got a great deal of satisfaction out of when I study that, right? And it changed my perspective. What is it about the Stoics that you think that all of us can benefit from? I mean, because this is thousands of years of wisdom and knowledge, right? Or even
Right.
Aristotle.
Yeah.
And Aristotle wasn't so much of a Stoic, I guess. I mean, he had some elements of Stoicism, but what is it about Stoicism that you find attractive or that we need to know?
Yeah. Stoicism is quite possibly the number one influence on these ideas. And when you study Stoicism, you find that they were trying to do the same thing, thousands of years ago. The human mind has not changed fundamentally, right? And they were looking in themselves and they were essentially asking, what changes can I make to the way I deal with the world, the way I deal with my life, and the way I deal with circumstances that I can't necessarily control. So it's this idea of not trying so hard to control the things that are out of our control and working more and more to control our own responses, our own interpretations, and our own emotions in response to those things. And really, it's I mean, you can see it just by reading one of these books, like the Enchiridion or Meditations, right? You start noticing, wow, this is already like having this effect, right? I mean, it makes so much sense that I wouldn't, for example, expect everything to go according to my plan. I wouldn't expect to go about my day and not meet any difficult people,
Mm-hmm.
right? It makes total sense once you start reading it. Yeah, of course I'm going about this the wrong way. And you start coming across these different tricks that I've sort of represented as these algorithms, these open source snippets of code that the ancients gave us. You've got the negative visualization where you can sort of practice this reflection on the things that you inevitably can and will lose, the things that can go wrong, the way that your life may not go according to plan. And when you start making a habit of this, you start, one, developing more gratitude for the things
Mm-hmm.
that you do
For
have in your
sure.
life, but two, it doesn't hit you as hard when you lose these things if you're mentally prepared for them. Right. So that's just one example of, probably hundreds of algorithms that you can find sprinkled through the works that can improve your mind. And that was one of the first influences and still is one of my greatest influences that helps me sort of make improvements to my software. Right.
Yeah, I love that. I agree with you. I think, and that's why I was really curious as you were bringing up. I see a lot of stoicism within this, and
You just quote a lot of that, right? I mean, that's like you said, it's the basis of your work.
Yeah, that's one of the big bases. And yeah, I mean, there you can definitely get into these ideas through the sort of popular
Hmm.
teachings, but it does go deeper once you get
Right.
into the actual ancients. I mean, you could study Stoicism in a secondhand form and not even know the role of virtue, for example, which was really at the heart of Stoicism. The whole idea is that none of the circumstances that matter, none of the circumstances that happen to you in your life actually are what matters. They're not good or bad. They just
Right.
sort of have the illusion of being good or bad. That's the part everyone knows. The part that is less known is that they say that virtue is essentially the only true good, which
yeah,
means, not just virtue in the sense of morality, but essentially the character traits and strengths that you demonstrate in response to these things are essentially the real sort of landscape of well-being and of the good life. So essentially, once you really get into it, it starts training you to think, um, not to put less weight on the things that are happening to you and a lot more weight on the way that you are sort of displaying your character traits and response to them. Depression isn't just a, serotonin deficiency or something like that. It very deeply relates to our view of ourselves and our own strengths. And the opposite of depression, I use the term that was used by the ancient Greeks, eudaimonia. Interestingly enough, 2,000 years ago, they had a very strong intuition themselves that the highest peak of well-being was deeply tied to virtue, and that they basically, all these philosophies from Aristotle to the Stoics to Plato, they all kind of agreed like the more virtue you bring into your behaviors, the happier you are. Even like, Socrates chose to be executed when he could have escaped because he didn't want to live a life where he didn't approve of himself and see himself demonstrating these traits. And so you can see this in a lot of these ancient thinkers, and it lines up very well with modern research. I mean, I have proposed that eudaimonia is the opposite end of the spectrum to clinical depression.
So you started kind of in the introduction, you kind of mentioned how you started thinking about these things from a very early age. Can you kind of brush onto how you got involved in psychology, how you got involved in philosophy, kind of what brought you down that path?
Yeah, I remember from a very early age just generally being very curious about the big questions in life, and also my own mind. So I was, I remember like stumbling across a lot of philosophical concepts that I would later learn the term for, just kind of in my own reflections, and coming up with a lot of ideas about what's going on in my own mind and how we change our own minds, how we, influence our own emotions. And, thinking I had a lot of original ideas, and then eventually exploring a lot of these other thinkers and realizing they all beat me to it by 2,000 years.
Dude, that's always the worst. Like you're reading some Nietzsche, and it's like, oh, I thought of that before, but that's also that's the reason why
Right.
Nietzsche like resonates with so many people, right? It's like you read it, and he touches on so many things that we think about, you know.
He was so ahead of his time in that sense.
Yep.
A lot of the stuff is obvious to us now because we have, modern neuroscience and stuff. But when I
Yep.
read Nietzsche, I'm like, how did he intuit all this at such a, hundreds of years ago, basically?
Yeah, and then it's also so many thinkers have been inspired by Nietzsche. So, you'll be
Oh,
reading
yeah.
Freud or Jung, and then you kind of touch on, and then if you go back to Nietzsche, you're like, oh yeah, these guys were inspired by him. Um,
Yeah. And I connect him to Maslow too. There's so much connection between Nietzsche's self-becoming and Maslow's self-actualization, right?
so I haven't really read any Maslow. I've kind of brushed on him as far as what his like five, like going towards self-actualization, the like five needs or whatever. Could
Yeah.
you kind of brush on Maslow and kind of what you pulled from him in your writings?
Yeah. Great question. He's my all-time favorite psychological thinker. Assuming we create this distinction between like Nietzsche is a philosopher and Maslow is a
Yep.
psychologist, really, I think they were kind of the same thing and we just categorize them differently. Maslow is known as the like pyramid of self-actualization guy, but really he never drew that pyramid and he never quite laid it out the same way that others have in characterizing him. Really, his concept of self-actualization was this incredibly rich vision of human health. And he's I mean, his writing just pulls you in if you read like Toward a Psychology of Being or The Farther Reaches of Human Nature. But essentially what he's arguing is that there is a core of psychological health within each of us. You could think of it like an acorn of values that has the sort of DNA to become an oak tree. And he made this comparison. Nietzsche, I believe, has made this comparison too. This idea that we have values in us that sort of provide a blueprint for who we are to become, and that we can find evidence of this through our evaluative impulses about the world. And Maslow basically said, not enough people are becoming who they are capable of becoming. Not enough people are able to pursue this path toward this sort of ideal state of both, happiness and altruism and the maximization of their potential. And why is that? And so he sort of created this field that, has sort of become positive psychology, but actually focusing on creating the conditions to cultivate deep human well-being instead of just focusing on curing illness and ailments.
So then that kind of brings us to your books. designing the mind and become who you are, right? You're
Right.
trying to lay out a way in which you can reach that self-actualization. You can say become who you are by designing your mind. Uh,
Right.
so I kind of wanted to ask you, as far as become who you are, how do you become who you are, and how do you find out who you are, I guess?
Yeah, that's a big question. So I think for me, a lot of that happened when I was a kid and I was going on long walks and asking myself a lot of these questions that I was just genuinely curious about. I think most of us today have so many like distractions and temptations that we don't ever really spend enough time with ourselves to gain this self-understanding. Ultimately, there are a lot of people sort of trying to tell you how you should live your life, how someone of your group should be living, and ultimately, I think it's safe to pretty much tune those things out and start trusting your own compass. You've got a compass inside your head that points directly toward the things that you admire most, that you value in other people, and that's telling you how to live and direct and navigate your life. You just need to get better at listening to it and doing those things that will actually take you further in that direction. So I think, getting better at listening to and actually trusting that voice of admiration, ultimately well-being can be a lot simpler than I think we make it out to be. There's a million little habits people tell you to do to be optimally happy. But ultimately, I think the big one comes down to doing the things that earn your own admiration and following those ideals that are inscribed in your own brain wherever they lead.
So we're taking control of that sociometer in our heads that motivates us to do what the tribe values, and really thinking about what we ourselves value and admire, and living in accordance with those values. Sounds like Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels there. Yeah, the new book, Become Who You Are, is really, I think, the best thing I've written yet, I would say.
That's good.
And potentially the most valuable one. So I'm glad that's the one you've dug into.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to do my best to summarize this one.
Yeah, I
if you
guess
want.
is virtue self-signaling, is that the best way to kind of the best umbrella under which the rest of it falls? It's because it's hard because there's a lot of like distinctive terms and there's a few diagrams. And if at any point, when I'm editing this, I can throw some of the diagrams over if that's going to help people understand. But I mean, do you have a good way of kind of covering the different elements of the theory, and then we can begin to dive down on what really interests us?
Yeah, so I think you're right. Virtue self-signaling theory is the heart of the book, but I kind of wait till around the middle of the book to introduce it directly, and I approach it from a few different angles before that. So I start out with a very sort of common sense, practical philosophy explanation, where I'm basically laying out a map of how most people navigate their own happiness, and then presenting a kind of third dimension to this map that more closely maps onto the way our well-being actually operates in our minds. And so I'm happy to dig more into that part one. But part two is sort of the theory, and approaching this theory more from an evolutionary standpoint, a philosophical standpoint, a clinical standpoint, and sort of making the case that this is how our brains evolved to operate, and there's evidence to suggest that this is how they operate today. And then the part three is more advice based on the best treatment methods, looking at self-esteem and depression and well-being, and saying how can we elevate our position on the scale. It resulted in this whole sort of theory that I put forward in this new book on depression, how it's caused, and what the sort of the root of it is. And it's really centered around our personal virtues, or our character strengths, our skills. My understanding of what happened to me during that period is that I was gradually cut off from the ability to see and observe my own strengths, my own virtues that I had prided myself on. Virtue is kind of an outdated sounding word to us today, but it's got a really rich philosophical history, and it ties into a lot of things. And I've found more and more how crucial this component is. When we look at people who are depressed, who have low self-esteem, when we really examine what's going through their head, they're questioning certain virtues like their own competence, their own lovability. When we have these distorted beliefs, we are ultimately deceived about our own virtues. We aren't seeing them clearly. And in some cases, when we adopt a really idle lifestyle where we're not getting out of bed, we're not leaving the house, we're not doing anything besides kind of sitting around and streaming, playing video games, whatever it is, we're not giving those virtues an opportunity to come out. We're not exercising them. And as a result, our brain is observing us and it's not seeing evidence of those strengths.
A piece of advice I was given probably 10 years ago, maybe 11 years ago, very early on in my journey, was to double down on your strengths and just bring your weaknesses to core competence. And that has served me tremendously well over the last 11 years. And asking the question, which I don't think enough people do, is what's something that you find easy that other people find difficult? And that can be a catalyst question for, okay, this is where I should be spending more time, energy, focus, and attention. And again, coming back to the power of questions.